June 28th, 1712, Geneva. A watchmaker's wife dies 9 days after giving birth to her second son. The infant survives, but the father will never forgive him. That child, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, will grow up to reshape how humanity thinks about freedom, childhood, education, and government itself. But first, he'll have to survive a childhood that reads like a blueprint for producing either a broken man or a revolutionary genius. Isaac Rousseau was a watchmaker, a craftsman in a city famous for precision. But precision in craft didn't translate to stability in life. He was volatile, romantic, prone to tears and rages in equal measure. When his wife Suzanne died, he looked at the infant Jean-Jacques and saw a murderer, not metaphorically. He told the boy this directly, repeatedly, throughout his childhood. Your mother died because you were born. She loved you, and it killed her. Imagine being 5 years old and hearing that. Isaac did love his son in his own chaotic way. They would stay up late into the night, reading novels together, not children's books, adult romance novels, adventure stories, anything Isaac could find in his late wife's library. Jean-Jacques would later write that he had no childhood. He went directly from infant to thinking being, skipping the stage where most children play thoughtlessly. By age 6, he'd read Plutarch's Lives. He was absorbing stories of ancient Greek and Roman heroes, men who sacrificed everything for honor and republic, while sitting in a city that prided itself on being a modern republic. Geneva wasn't just any city. It was a Protestant stronghold, Calvinist to its core, governed by strict moral codes and an oligarchy of wealthy families. Citizens had rights, but only a fraction of the population qualified as citizens. The rest were subjects or residents, second-class inhabitants of a city that preached civic virtue while practicing exclusion. Jean-Jacques was born a citizen, a status he would cling to his entire life, even as he spent most of that life in exile from the city he loved and resented in equal measure. When Jean-Jacques was 10, everything fell apart. Isaac got into a dispute with a French captain over something trivial. The argument escalated. Swords were nearly drawn. Geneva's authorities sided with the Frenchman because he had connections. Isaac faced imprisonment, or worse, so he did what unstable men often do when cornered. He fled, just left, abandoned his son, and disappeared to another canton where Geneva's laws couldn't reach him. Jean-Jacques was sent to live with his uncle Bernard. Then he was sent away to board with a pastor in the countryside, a man named Lambertier, who was supposed to educate him. This is where things get strange. Rousseau would later describe, with uncomfortable frankness, an incident where Lambertier's sister spanked him for something he didn't do. The physical punishment awakened something in him, a confused mixture of shame and pleasure that he struggled to understand for years. He became obsessed with recreating that feeling, which led to more punishments, which created a cycle that disturbed him even as a child. By 13, he was back in Geneva, apprenticed to an engraver. The man was cruel. He beat Jean-Jacques for minor infractions, for ruined work, for hesitations. The workshop was a prison. The boy who'd read Plutarch and dreamed of Roman virtue was now filing metal plates under the fists of a petty tyrant. He started stealing, small things at first, apples from a neighbour's tree, tools he could sell. He wasn't starving. He stole for the thrill, for the small rebellion it represented, for reasons he couldn't articulate. March 14th, 1728. Jean-Jacques is 15 years old. He's been out walking in the countryside with friends, and they've stayed out too long. When they return to Geneva's gates at dusk, the gates are closed. This happened occasionally. The punishment for an apprentice returning late was a beating. He'd been beaten before, but something in him snapped. He looked at those closed gates and made a decision that would define everything that followed. He didn't go back. He just started walking. No plan, no money beyond a few coins, no destination. He walked away from Geneva, from his apprenticeship, from the only life he'd ever known. A 15-year-old boy on the roads of Savoy in 1728 was nobody. He could disappear completely, die in a ditch and no one would notice. That's almost what happened, except for a priest in the village of Confignon who saw this young vagrant and, instead of chasing him off, asked questions. The priest was Catholic, Geneva was militantly Protestant, but the priest saw an opportunity. This boy was educated, articulate, clearly from a decent family. He was also lost, desperate, and vulnerable. Perfect conversion material. The Catholic Church ran an entire infrastructure designed to convert Protestant refugees and runaways. They fed them, housed them, educated them, and slowly, patiently brought them into the fold. The priest sent Jean-Jacques to Annecy, to a woman named Madame de Warren. This is where Rousseau's life becomes difficult to believe. Françoise Louise de Warren was 28 years old, beautiful, charming, and herself a convert from Protestantism. She received a pension from the King of Sardinia for her conversion work, bringing lost Protestant souls to the true faith. When Jean-Jacques arrived at her door, in Annecy, she saw exactly what the priest had seen, a project, but also something else. She called him Petit, little one. She sent him to a hospice in Turin to undergo formal conversion to Catholicism. The process took months. Jean-Jacques learned catechism, attended Mass, and on April 21st, 1728, he formally renounced Protestantism and became Catholic. This wasn't a spiritual awakening. He later admitted he didn't believe any of it. He converted because he was hungry, homeless, and this was the price of survival. But that conversion meant he could never return to Geneva as a citizen. Geneva didn't tolerate apostates. He'd burned that bridge without fully realizing it. After his conversion, he wandered Turin working odd jobs. He became a footman for an aristocratic family. He was terrible at it. He stole a ribbon from the household and, when caught, blamed a young servant girl named Marion, who was subsequently fired and disgraced. This incident haunted Rousseau for the rest of his life. He wrote about it decades later in his Confessions with agonizing detail, trying to explain why he'd destroyed an innocent girl to save himself. He never found an explanation that satisfied him. He drifted back to Madame de Warren. By now he was 17, she was 30, and their relationship shifted into something that shocked even the relatively permissive society of 18th century France. She became his lover, not immediately. First, she sent him to study music at a seminary. He failed. His voice was adequate, but he couldn't master musical notation quickly enough. He tried other pursuits. He worked as a surveyor's assistant, a tutor, a music teacher. Everything he touched seemed to fall apart. But with Madame de Warren, called Maman by Jean-Jacques, he found something he'd never had. Stability, affection, a home. Her house in Chambéry became his refuge. She was running a complicated household, supported by her pension, but always on the edge of financial collapse, taking in boarders, managing schemes to manufacture various products, keeping multiple relationships alive. And in the middle of this chaos, she was educating Jean-Jacques, not formally, but she had books. She encouraged him to read philosophy, science, literature. She created space for him to think. Their physical relationship began when he was about 20. He described it later with ambivalence bordering on revulsion. He loved her, but not the way a man loves a woman. He loved her the way a child loves a mother, and the sexual dimension felt like a violation of that bond even as he participated in it. She was practical about the whole arrangement. She had other lovers, including her steward, Claude Anet, and seemed to view Jean-Jacques as another member of a complicated household that operated by rules quite different from conventional morality. For nearly a decade, Rousseau lived in this strange, suspended adolescence. He was in his 20s, but he hadn't launched into adult life. He read voraciously. He taught himself Latin well enough to read classical texts in the original. He studied mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, philosophy. He composed music, wrote poems, developed theories about everything from botany to political economy. He was becoming educated in the way autodidacts do, chaotically but deeply, following curiosity rather than curriculum. But Madame de Warrens's finances were collapsing. Her schemes failed. Her pension was unreliable. By the late 1730s, the household that had sheltered Rousseau was disintegrating. She took another lover, replacing Claude Arnay, who had died. This new man, Vincent, had no patience for Jean-Jacques, who was now in his late 20s and still living as a dependent in Maman's house. The atmosphere turned hostile. In 1740, Rousseau took a position as tutor to the children of Jean Bonneau de Mably in Lyon. He was 28 years old and had never held a real job for more than a few months. The tutoring was a disaster. He had theories about education, lots of them, but no practical ability to control or teach actual children. The Mably family tolerated him for a year before letting him go. But during that year, something shifted. He started writing seriously, not just letters and poems, but systematic works, an essay on education, observations on music. He was beginning to find his voice. He returned briefly to Madame de Warrens, but the relationship was over. She was broke, distracted, involved with Vincent. Jean-Jacques was no longer petit. He was a grown man with no prospects, no money, and no clear path forward. In 1742, at age 30, he made a decision. He would go to Paris. He had developed a new system of musical notation that he believed would revolutionize music. He would present it to the Academy of Sciences, make his name, and finally become someone. Paris in 1742 was the intellectual capital of Europe. The Enlightenment was gathering momentum. Voltaire was already famous. Diderot was beginning his career. The salons were alive with debate about science, philosophy, religion, and politics. And into this world walked Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 30 years old, poorly dressed, speaking French with a thick accent, carrying a manuscript about musical notation that he was convinced would change everything. The Academy examined his system. Their verdict was polite but devastating, interesting but not practical, already done better by others. Thank you for your submission. Rousseau was crushed. His great innovation, the thing that was supposed to launch him, was dismissed as the work of an amateur, which is exactly what he was. But Paris didn't reject him entirely. He had letters of introduction, and the social networks of 18th century France operated on connections. He met people. He talked his way into circles of writers and philosophers. He was odd, clearly from the provinces, but he was also sharp, well-read, and had opinions about everything. Some people found him fascinating. Others thought he was an arrogant bore. He took a job as secretary to the French ambassador to Venice, the Comte de Montaigu. Finally, a real position, with status and salary. He lasted 11 months. Montaigu was incompetent and paranoid. Rousseau was insubordinate and self-righteous. They fought constantly. Rousseau accused the ambassador of corruption and mismanagement. Montaigu accused Rousseau of insolence and dereliction. The whole arrangement exploded, and Rousseau found himself back in Paris in 1744, unemployed again, but now with a burning resentment toward aristocratic privilege and incompetence. This was the pattern of Rousseau's early life. Brief moments of stability followed by collapse, always someone else's fault in his telling, always his own fault in others' accounts. But something was building. All those years of reading, thinking, observing, all the humiliations and failures and stolen moments of education were fermenting into something unprecedented. He just didn't know it yet. In Paris, he fell in with the philosophes, the radical thinkers who were beginning to question everything about French society. Diderot became a genuine friend. They would meet at cafes, argue for hours, share ideas. Diderot was working on the Encyclopédie, an ambitious project to catalogue all human knowledge and subtly undermine religious and political orthodoxy in the process. Rousseau contributed articles on music. He was becoming part of something larger than himself, a movement that believed human reason could reshape the world. And then there was Thérèse Levasseur, She was a laundress at Rousseau's hotel, 23 years old when they met in 1745. Thérèse couldn't read or write. She never learned, despite living with one of the most famous writers in Europe. She couldn't tell time from a clock face. Her mother, Madame Levasseur, was grasping and manipulative, constantly meddling in their affairs. By every standard of 18th century intellectual society, Thérèse was an impossible match for a philosophe, and yet Rousseau stayed with her for 33 years, eventually marrying her in 1768. What did he see in her? He claimed she was honest, uncorrupted by education, natural. She didn't challenge him intellectually, which some have argued was exactly the point. After a lifetime of feeling inadequate around educated people, here was someone who made him feel superior. Others suggest genuine affection, companionship, comfort in her simplicity. Whatever the reason, Thérèse became the permanent fixture in Rousseau's chaotic life, but there was a darkness in this arrangement that would haunt Rousseau forever and destroy his reputation in the eyes of many. Between 1746 and 1755, Thérèse gave birth to 5 children. Rousseau took each one, shortly after birth, and abandoned them at the Enfants Trouvés, the foundling hospital in Paris. All 5. He never saw them again, never knew what happened to them. The mortality rate at such institutions was catastrophic. Most children died within a year. Rousseau almost certainly condemned his own children to death. How do we understand this? Rousseau himself tried to justify it in the Confessions. He claimed poverty, that he couldn't afford to raise children. He blamed Madame Levasseur, saying she would have ruined them. He argued that the foundling hospital was what poor people did, that it was common practice. He even suggested it was better for the children, that they'd be raised as workers rather than corrupted by his own failures as a father. None of these excuses hold up. Other poor writers raised children. Diderot did. Rousseau wasn't destitute during these years. He was working, earning money, living reasonably well. The truth seems simpler and more damning. Children were an inconvenience. They would have interfered with his work, his freedom, his self-conception as a thinker. And so he disposed of them. The man who would write Emile, one of the most influential books on education and child-rearing ever published, abandoned his own 5 children to almost certain death. The man who would argue that humans are naturally good and corrupted only by society personally enacted a cruelty that society rightly condemned. His enemies never let him forget it. Voltaire, when their friendship turned to bitter enmity, publicly exposed Rousseau's abandonment of his children, holding it up as proof of his hypocrisy. Rousseau had no defense except to say he regretted it, that it was the worst thing he'd ever done. But regret doesn't resurrect the dead. This is the central paradox of Rousseau, capable of profound moral insight and appalling moral failure. A man who could describe the corruption of civilization with piercing accuracy while being unable to see his own corruption clearly. Genius and monstrosity don't cancel each other out. They coexist, and we have to hold both. Through the late 1740s, Rousseau was still nobody in particular. He wrote articles, composed music, scraped together a living. He attended salons where the wealthy and educated gathered to discuss ideas. He was tolerated, sometimes mocked for his awkwardness and provincial manners, but not taken seriously. Then came October 1749, and everything changed. Diderot had been imprisoned at Vincennes for writing irreligious works. Rousseau, worried about his friend, walked from Paris to visit him. It was a long walk, several miles in the heat. To pass the time, he picked up a copy of the Mercure de France, a literary magazine. In it he saw an announcement. The Academy of Dijon was sponsoring an essay conte. Est. The question: has the restoration of the sciences and arts contributed to the purification of morals? It was the kind of question academies loved. Everyone expected essays arguing yes, progress in knowledge leads to moral improvement. Civilization refines us. Learning makes us better. This was Enlightenment orthodoxy. But as Rousseau walked along that dusty road, something erupted in his mind. He later described it as a kind of vision, an overwhelming illumination. Suddenly he saw the answer with perfect clarity, and the answer was no. The sciences and arts have corrupted us. Civilization has made us worse, not better. We were happier, more virtuous, more honest before all this supposed progress. He arrived at Vincennes in a state of agitation, his shirt soaked with tears. Diderot Lys, tend as Rousseau, poured out the ideas tumbling through his head. Diderot, always the shrewd operator, told him to write it, to enter the contest. It was a radical position, almost perverse, but it was original, and originality got attention. Rousseau wrote the Discourse on the Sciences and Arts in a white heat. It was unlike anything being written by the philosophe. Where Voltaire and Diderot celebrated reason, progress, and the triumph of enlightenment over superstition, Rousseau argued the opposite. We have lost something essential. Ancient Sparta, with no arts or sciences, produced virtuous citizens. Modern Paris, drowning in culture and learning, produces vanity, deception, and moral weakness. Politeness is a mask for selfishness. Refinement breeds artificiality. Knowledge puffs us up, but doesn't make us good. The Academy of Dijon awarded him first prize in 1750. The essay was published. It became a sensation. Here was someone arguing against the entire project of the Enlightenment, and doing so with rhetorical brilliance. People were outraged, delighted, confused. Who was this Rousseau? Responses flooded in. Critics called him a fool, a charlatan, someone who wanted to drag humanity back to caves. Stanislas, the King of Poland, wrote a rebuttal. So did other philosophers and scientists. Rousseau responded to them all, sharpening his arguments, clarifying his position. Suddenly, at age 38, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was famous. But fame in the 18th century wasn't the same as success. It didn't bring wealth automatically. Rousseau still needed to work. He continued copying music, which he did with meticulous care, charging by the page. It was humble work for someone now recognized as an important thinker, but it gave him independence. He didn't have to flatter patrons or compromise his ideas for money. He could say what he thought, and what he thought was becoming more radical. The first discourse had been a provocation, but Rousseau wasn't finished. The question that had opened during that walk to Vincennes kept expanding. If civilization corrupts, what were we like before? If arts and sciences make us worse, what is the natural state of humanity? In 1755, he published the Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality among Men, known as the Second Discourse. This wasn't just a critique of modern society, it was a revolutionary reimagining of human history and nature. Rousseau described the state of nature, the hypothetical condition of humans before society existed. Most philosophers, following Hobbes, imagined this as a nightmare. Life in the state of nature was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Humans were naturally selfish and violent. Only the social contract and government restrained our worst impulses. Rousseau turned this upside down. In the state of nature, humans were solitary, yes, but not violent. They were peaceful, healthy, free. They had no language, no property, no complex thoughts. They wandered forests, eating fruit, sleeping under trees, occasionally mating without attachment. They felt compassion, a natural pity wig, then seeing another creature suffer. They were neither good nor evil because morality requires society. They simply were. This was the noble savage, though Rousseau never used that phrase. Natural man was an animal, but a content one. No anxiety about the future, no envy, no comparison with others, just existence. Then something changed. Humans settled down. They formed communities. Someone planted a crop and said, "This is mine." Property was invented. With property came inequality. Some land was better, some people stronger or cleverer. Wealth accumulated, hierarchies formed, and once you have inequality, you need laws to protect it, governments to enforce those laws. The social contract wasn't a noble agreement among equals. It was a fraud perpetrated by the rich to trick the poor into accepting their own subjugation. You have nothing, I have everything. Let's make laws that protect property. You agree because you're told it's for everyone's benefit, but really it just locks in my advantage. This was explosive. Rousseau was arguing that inequality wasn't natural or inevitable. It was created by society, by civilization itself, and that meant it could be undone. The second discourse didn't offer solutions. It was diagnosis, not prescription, but the implications were obvious. If inequality is artificial, if civilization corrupted us, then maybe we need a different kind of society, one that preserves freedom while allowing us to live together. One that reflects the general will, not the private interest of the powerful. These ideas would fully flower in the social contract, but already Rousseau was being seen as dangerous. The second discourse was banned in Geneva, his birthplace, the city he'd proudly claimed as his identity. They condemned it as destructive to religion and morality. Rousseau was hurt, angry, but also energized. He was saying things no one else dared say. He was alone against the intellectual establishment, which fit perfectly with his self-image as the truth-teller rejected by a corrupt world. His relationship with the other philosophes was deteriorating. They found him prickly, paranoid, self-righteous. He found them superficial, compromised, too willing to flatter the powerful. Diderot tried to keep the peace, but even that friendship was straining. The breaking point came over something absurd, a question of whether Rousseau should accept a royal pension. To Rousseau, this was a matter of principle. Accepting money from the king meant obligation, dependence, corruption. To the others, it was just practical. Take the money. Keep your independence, in fact, if not appearance. Everyone did it. Rousseau refused, and took their advice as evidence that they didn't understand him, that they were already corrupted by the system they claimed to critique. He was probably impossible to be friends with, interpreting every disagreement as betrayal, every piece of advice as an attack. But he was also right that the other philosophi were more comfortable with power than they admitted. They dined with aristocrats, dedicated books to princes, softened their critiques to avoid real danger. Rousseau wouldn't. In 1756, he left Paris entirely. A wealthy admirer, Madame d'Épinay, offered him a cottage on her estate at Montmorency, just outside the city. The Hermitage, it was called, small, rustic, surrounded by woods. Finally, Rousseau could live simply, close to nature, away from the corruption of urban society. He moved in with Thérèse and her nightmare of a mother. For a while he was happy. He walked in the forests, worked in the garden, wrote. This was the life he'd been describing in his essays, the return to simplicity. Of course it didn't last. He fell obsessively in love with Sophie Duteau, a young woman who visited the estate. She was already in a relationship and had no serious interest in the awkward, intense philosopher twice her age. Rousseau's infatuation was entirely in his head, but it consumed him. He wrote her passionate letters. He dreamed elaborate fantasies. She was kind but firm. Nothing happened, but the emotional affair wrecked Rousseau's relationship with Madame d'Épinay, who was Sophie's friend and Rousseau's patron. By 1757, the whole arrangement collapsed in accusations and bitterness. Rousseau moved to a different cottage nearby, but the damage was done. Still, these years at Montmorency, from 1756 to 1762, were the most productive of his life. In 6 years, he wrote the 3 works that would define his legacy and change the world. Julie, or the New Heloise, published in 1761, was a novel, an epistolary romance about forbidden love, virtue, and the conflict between passion and duty. It became one of the best-selling books of the entire 18th century. People wept over it, wrote Rousseau letters saying it had changed their lives. It proved he wasn't just a philosopher. He could move hearts, tell stories, create characters readers loved. Then in 1762, two bombshells. Emile, or On Education, was published in May. The Social Contract followed weeks later. These weren't just books. They were grenades thrown into the foundations of European society. Emile was an educational treatise disguised as a novel, following a boy's development from birth to adulthood under the guidance of an ideal tutor. Rousseau argued that children aren't miniature adults to be stuffed with facts and beaten into obedience. They're naturally good, naturally curious. Education should nurture these qualities, not crush them. Let the child explore, make mistakes, learn from experience. Don't force Latin grammar on a 6-year-old. Let him run in fields, observe insects, ask questions. Knowledge should come when the child is ready, when natural curiosity makes learning joyful rather than torturous. This sounds obvious now. In 1762, it was revolutionary. European education was brutal. Memorization, corporal punishment, rigid hierarchy. Children were little savages to be civilized through discipline and classical texts. Rousseau said the opposite. Society corrupts. The child's natural instincts are trustworthy. The tutor's job is to guide, not dominate. Create environments where the child learns naturally. Protect him from artificial social pressures for as long as possible. The book had an entire section, The Profession of Faith of the Savoyard Vicar, where Rousseau laid out his religious views. He rejected organized religion, dogma, priests, revelation, but he wasn't an atheist like some of the philosophes. He believed in God, in a divine creator whose existence was proven by the order and beauty of nature. He believed in the soul's immortality, in conscience as an innate moral guide. Natural religion, he called it, direct feeling, not theological argument. The heart knows God without needing church authorities to explain. Both Catholics and Protestants lost their minds. Within weeks of publication, Emile was condemned by the Archbishop of Paris and banned. The Parliament of Paris ordered it burned publicly and issued a warrant for Rousseau's arrest. He'd insulted the church, undermined religious education, promoted dangerous ideas about letting children run wild. Geneva, his birthplace, which he'd idealized in all his writings, also banned the book and ordered Rousseau arrested if he ever returned. The social contract hit even harder in the long run, though its immediate impact was smaller because fewer people read dense political philosophy than novels about education. The opening line became immortal. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One thinks himself the master of others, and still remains a greater slave than they. What justified political authority? Not tradition, not conquest, not divine right, only consent. Legitimate government exists through a social contract, where individuals come together and agree to form a community. They surrender their natural freedom, the ability to do whatever they want in exchange for civil freedom, living under laws they've participated in making. Sovereignty belongs to the people collectively, not to a king, not to an aristocracy. The general will, the collective rational judgment of what serves the common good, should guide the state. This was dangerous. Rousseau wasn't advocating for representative democracy like England's Parliament. He thought representation was a betrayal. In a true republic, citizens participate directly in making laws. Representation makes them passive, turns them into subjects rather than active citizens. Small states where everyone can gather and vote were the ideal. Large modern states had already fallen into corruption. Their complexity required representatives who inevitably became a separate class pursuing their own interests rather than the common good. Rousseau's political vision was contradictory, impossible, radical. He wanted freedom but insisted that individuals could be forced to be free, compelled to obey the general will even against their personal desires. He praised ancient Sparta's militaristic communalism. He thought religion should be civil, controlled by the state to ensure citizens were loyal. Those who didn't subscribe to the state's civil religion should be banished. Anyone who accepted it but violated its principles should be executed. Robespierre would later carry the social contract in his pocket during the Terror. The book became a Bible for revolutionaries, proof that legitimate authority came from the people, that kings were usurpers, that society could be remade according to rational principles. But it also justified coercion in the name of freedom, violence in the name of virtue. Rousseau hadn't intended to inspire guillotines, but his ideas contained that possibility. By June 1762, Rousseau was a fugitive. He fled France with arrest imminent, crossed into Swiss territory, and found temporary refuge in Yverdon. But Geneva's condemnation meant Switzerland wasn't safe either. He moved to Moutier, a village in Prussian-controlled territory, under the theoretical protection of Frederick the Great, who didn't particularly care about religious controversies and found the persecution of philosophers embarrassing to his enlightened reputation. Rousseau settled into another cottage. He wore Armenian robes, bizarre flowing garments he claimed were more comfortable than European clothes. He collected plants, continued his botanical studies, wrote letters defending his books against mounting criticism. He was famous now, more famous than he'd ever wanted to be. Emile was a bestseller despite, or because of, the bans. Everyone was reading it, arguing about it. The social contract was spreading through underground networks, discussed in salons and coffee houses. Rousseau's name was everywhere. But so was the Backlash. Voltaire despised him. Their rivalry had been simmering for years. Voltaire found Rousseau's primitivism absurd, his sentimentality tiresome, his attacks on theatre and civilization offensive. In 1760, Rousseau had published a letter tracing Geneva's moral superiority to its lack of theatres, a direct insult to Voltaire, who lived near Geneva and loved theatre. Voltaire never forgave him. Now with Rousseau vulnerable and in exile, Voltaire struck. He wrote pamphlets mocking Rousseau's ideas, exposing personal details about his life, particularly the abandoned children. How dare this man, who dumped 5 infants at an orphanage, write a book about education? How dare he preach virtue while living in sin with an illiterate servant? Voltaire's attacks were cruel, personal, designed to destroy Rousseau's reputation. He published a fake letter, supposedly, from a Prussian pastor denouncing Rousseau. He spread rumours, told half-truths, weaponized every embarrassing detail he could find. Rousseau, paranoid and thin-skinned under the best circumstances, spiraled. He was convinced a vast conspiracy was forming against him. Voltaire, Diderot, d'Alembert, the philosophes, the church, the governments of France and Geneva, all working together to destroy him. It sounds insane, except that people really were trying to destroy him. Books were banned, arrest warrants issued, pamphlets attacking him published across Europe. The paranoia had a basis in reality, but Rousseau took it further, seeing coordination where there was only opportunistic pile-on. In 1765, the situation in Moutier became untenable. The local pastor, encouraged by authorities in Berne, preached sermons against Rousseau. The villagers, whipped into religious fervour, turned hostile. One night someone threw stones through Rousseau's windows. He fled again, this time to the tiny island of Saint-Pierre in the middle of Lake Biel. 2 months of peace wandering the island, studying plants, feeling briefly safe. Then the Bernese authorities ordered him to leave. Nowhere in Switzerland would take him. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, offered rescue. Hume was in Paris, celebrated and beloved despite being an atheist, or perhaps because his atheism was so polite and undogmatic. He'd read Rousseau's work with admiration. When he heard about the persecution, he arranged for Rousseau to come to England, promising safety and a pension. In January 1766, Rousseau and Thérèse crossed the Channel. England welcomed him. He was a celebrity. Everyone wanted to meet the famous philosopher. King George III granted him a pension. Hume found him a country house in Staffordshire, Wootton Hall, remote and quiet. For 3 months, it worked. Then Rousseau's paranoia fixed on Hume. He decided that Hume was part of the conspiracy, that the pension was a trap, that Hume was secretly mocking him, reporting on him, working with Voltaire to orchestrate his humiliation. None of this was true. Hume was bewildered, hurt, trying desperately to understand what he'd done wrong. Rousseau wrote him wild accusatory letters. Hume, with Scottish patience, tried to reason with him, then gave up. Rousseau fled Wootton, convinced assassins were coming. He wandered England in disguise, staying in cheap inns, using fake names, terrified. In May 1767, he returned to France illegally, still under arrest warrant, but gambling that authorities had lost interest. He was right. Nobody bothered arresting him. He wandered from town to town, under assumed names, never staying long. Thérèse stayed with him through all of it, this strange loyal woman who couldn't read his books, but followed him through exile after exile, panic after panic. Finally, in 1770, he returned to Paris. The arrest warrant was quietly dropped. He was allowed to stay as long as he kept quiet, didn't publish anything inflammatory. He was 58, exhausted, broken. He moved into a small apartment, copied music for money, went on long walks, avoided the literary world that had once courted him. People recognized him on the streets. Some crossed to the other side to avoid him. Others approached with reverence. He was polite but distant, locked inside his own head. These final years produced his last great work, though he never published it. The Confessions, an autobiography unlike anything written before. Rousseau decided to tell his entire life story with complete honesty, hiding nothing. The abandoned children, the sexual peculiarities, the betrayals and failures, the humiliations, everything. He would expose himself totally, let the world judge him as he truly was rather than as his enemies portrayed him. He began public readings in Paris salons in 1770, inviting audiences to hear sections. The readings were sensational, disturbing, riveting. Rousseau's voice confessing shameful details, daring listeners to condemn him, insisting that despite everything he was fundamentally good. After a few readings, the police banned them. Too inflammatory, too destabilizing. The Confessions wouldn't be published until after his death. He also wrote Rousseau's Judge of Jean-Jacques, an even stranger work, a dialogue between Rousseau and a fictional Frenchman discussing Jean-Jacques, referring to himself in third person, trying to defend his character against the conspiracy he still believed surrounded him. It's painful to read, a brilliant mind eating itself. The final work was the Reveries of the Solitary Walker, 10 meditations written during his last 2 years. He's given up on society, on defending himself, on being understood. These are private reflections, walks through the countryside around Paris, observations of plants, memories, attempts to find peace. The tone is melancholy, but also serene. He's found a kind of acceptance. The fifth walk describes his time on St. Pierre Island as the happiest period of his life. Those 2 months of solitude and botanical observation before being expelled. Happiness, he concludes, isn't found in society, achievement, or recognition. It's found in existence itself, in being present to the moment, in the simple awareness of living. In May 1778, a French aristocrat, the Marquis de Girardin, offered Rousseau and Thérèse a cottage on his estate at Ermenonville, north of Paris. The estate had beautiful grounds, woods, lakes, gardens. Rousseau accepted. They moved in. He seemed content, walking the grounds, playing with Girardin's children, collecting plants. On July 2nd, 1778, after a morning walk, Rousseau collapsed. He died later that day, possibly from a stroke. He was 66. Thérèse was with him. The Marquis arranged burial on the estate, on the island of Poplars in the middle of a small lake, a romantic setting Rousseau would have appreciated. 14 years later, during the Revolution, his body was exhumed and transferred to the Pantheon in Paris, the temple honouring France's great men. He was placed near Voltaire, his old enemy. The Revolution claimed both as fathers, though their visions of Enlightenment had been incompatible. Rousseau's ideas, the sovereignty of the people, the general will, the social contract, these became revolutionary doctrine. His face appeared on pamphlets, his name in speeches. Robespierre venerated him. The Terror tried to implement virtue through violence, exactly the nightmare Rousseau's Contradictions enabled even as the man himself would have recoiled. The impact was just beginning. Everything he'd written, the inequality essay, the social contract, Emile, the confessions, all of it would echo through the next 2 centuries, shaping Romanticism, nationalism, education theory, democratic movements, psychology, autobiography as a genre. Writers learned from him that feeling mattered, that the self was worth examining, that nature offered truth the civilization obscured. Politicians learned that legitimate government required consent, that sovereignty belonged to the people, that society could be remade according to rational principles. The philosophers who came after couldn't ignore him. Kant read Emile and reportedly missed his daily walk for the first time in years. So absorbed he lost track of time. He said Rousseau set him straight, taught him to honour humanity. Hegel saw in the general will an early glimpse of the dialectic, the movement of spirit through history. Marx borrowed the alienation concept, transforming it from a story about civilization corrupting natural goodness into a materialist critique of capitalism alienating workers from their labour. The Romantics worshipped him. Wordsworth and Coleridge walked the Lake District discussing his ideas about nature and education. Byron carried his books across Europe. Goethe's young Werther, the sensitive soul destroyed by society's constraints, was Rousseau's spiritual descendant. The entire Romantic movement, with its elevation of emotion over reason, individual authenticity over social convention, nature over artifice, flows directly from Rousseau's springs. Even those who despised him couldn't escape his orbit. Burke, horrified by the French Revolution's violence, blamed Rousseau's abstract theorizing, his willingness to sacrifice real people for ideal systems. Conservatives for 2 centuries would see in Rousseau the archetypal, dangerous intellectual, the man whose beautiful theories justified guillotines. They weren't entirely wrong. The social contract contains the seed of something terrifying. If the general will represents the true interest of the people, and if individuals who disagree are simply confused about their real will, then forcing them to comply becomes forcing them to be free. It's a short step from that to justifying tyranny in democracy's name. Totalitarian movements left and right claimed Rousseau as ancestor. The Jacobins during the Terror. Nationalist movements across 19th century Europe arguing that the people, properly understood, constituted a single organic will. Even 20th century authoritarians found useful language in his work, the idea that true freedom meant submission to the collective. This wasn't what Rousseau intended. Reading him carefully, you find someone deeply conflicted, aware of the tensions in his thought, struggling to reconcile individual liberty with social cohesion, natural goodness with civilized corruption. He never resolved the contradictions. Maybe they're unresolvable, but the fact that his ideas could be twisted into justifications for oppression reveals something unstable at their core, yet his influence on education remains overwhelmingly positive. Emile revolutionized how the West thinks about childhood. Before Rousseau, children were seen as miniature adults, blank slates to be filled with knowledge, wills to be broken and molded. Rousseau insisted children have their own nature, developmental stages that must be respected, innate curiosity that should be nurtured rather than suppressed. Modern progressive education, from Montessori to Dewey to contemporary student-centered learning, traces back to Emile. The idea that education should develop the whole person, not just transmit information, that learning should connect to experience, not abstract memorization. That childhood has intrinsic value, not just as preparation for adulthood. These are Rousseauian principles, now so embedded in pedagogy we forget they were once radical. His impact on literature might be even more profound. The Confessions invented modern autobiography. Before Rousseau, autobiographies were public documents, records of achievements, justifications of careers. Augustine's Confessions, the classical model, focused on spiritual journey toward God, not psychological self-examination. Rousseau wrote about masturbation, petty thefts, sexual humiliation, cruelty to servants, his abandonment of his children. He exposed shameful secrets not to repent, but to be understood, to insist that despite everything, he was a good person, misjudged and persecuted. This was revolutionary. It established the template for confessional literature, the idea that the private self, especially the shameful parts, was worthy of public scrutiny. Every memoir of addiction, abuse or scandal written since owes something to Rousseau's willingness to expose himself completely. The Reveries pioneered another genre entirely. Those 10 walks, meditations on memory, nature and consciousness, established the personal essay as literature. Montaigne had written essays centuries earlier, but Rousseau's were different, more introspective, more concerned with the texture of inner experience. He influenced Wordsworth's Prelude, Thoreau's Walden, Proust's Search for Lost Time. The entire tradition of writing that tries to capture the flow of consciousness, the associations of memory, the quality of subjective experience, begins here on Rousseau's solitary walks around Paris. His political legacy remains contested, dangerous, essential. The French Revolution tried to build a society on his principles and drowned in blood. But every democratic movement since has drawn on his insistence that legitimate government requires popular consent, that sovereignty resides in the people, that laws must express the general will rather than particular interests. The American founders read him, though they filtered his ideas through Republican skepticism about direct democracy. Lincoln's government of the people, by the people, for the people, echoes Rousseau's language. Iversall's Declaration of Human Rights reflects his conviction that all humans possess natural equality and dignity. Decolonization movements in the 20th century used his critique of inequality and domination to challenge European imperialism. His argument that civilization corrupts found new life in environmentalism. If humanity's natural state was harmony with nature, and if progress has alienated us from that harmony, then perhaps industrial civilization is the problem. Deep ecologists, primitivists, critics of technological society all invoke Rousseau's vision, often simplifying it, sometimes distorting it, but recognizing in him an early voice of dissent against modernity's trajectory. Psychology and psychiatry owe him debts they rarely acknowledge. His obsessive self-examination, his attempts to trace adult neuroses to childhood experiences, his conviction that understanding required excavating buried memories, all anticipate psychoanalysis. Freud never cited him, but the Confessions reads like a pre-Freudian case study, the patient analysing himself, seeking patterns, insisting that seemingly inexplicable behaviours have hidden causes rooted in early trauma. His paranoia, documented so thoroughly in his later writings, became a case study in psychiatric literature. The persecution complex, the conspiracy theories, the inability to accept that misfortune might be random rather than orchestrated. Clinicians study his texts as symptoms, but even in his madness there's insight. His analysis of how reputation functions in society, how gossip and social judgment create invisible prisons, how the need for recognition traps us in patterns of self-betrayal. These observations remain acute regardless of whether the specific conspiracies he imagined were real. The contradictions that tormented him became philosophy's puzzles. How do we reconcile individual freedom with social obligation? Can inequality ever be justified? And if not, what do we do about natural differences in ability and circumstance? Is civilization progress or decline? Should we trust reason or sentiment? These aren't questions Rousseau answered. They're questions he forced us to ask with such urgency that ignoring them became impossible. Some philosophers build systems, grand architectures of thought where everything fits together. Rousseau wasn't that kind of thinker. He followed ideas to their conclusions even when those conclusions contradicted other things he'd written. He changed his mind. He wrote in different genres: fiction, philosophy, autobiography, music theory, each with its own logic and assumptions. Trying to extract a single, coherent, Rousseauian system from his collected works is probably a mistake. Maybe the contradictions are the point. Human beings are contradictory. We want freedom and belonging. We're naturally good and capable of terrible evil. We need society and resent its constraints. Reason guides us and leads us astray. Rousseau didn't resolve these tensions because they can't be resolved. We live in the contradiction. His personal failures haunt his legacy. How can we take seriously a theorist of education who abandoned his own children? How can we trust a philosopher of virtue who lied, stole, and betrayed friends? The gap between his ideals and his life seems disqualifying. Yet maybe that gap is instructive. He wasn't claiming to be virtuous. He was claiming to understand virtue, to see clearly what goodness required, even as he failed to achieve it. The Confessions is partly an extended meditation on that failure, an attempt to explain how someone who genuinely loved goodness could behave so badly. His answer: that society corrupted him, that circumstances conspired against him, that his natural goodness was deformed by the need to survive in a competitive world, is self-serving. But it's also the foundation of his social theory. If even someone as self-aware as Rousseau couldn't live virtuously in corrupt society, what hope do ordinary people have? The system needs changing, not just individuals. Or maybe the lesson is simpler and more damning. Brilliant analysis of social problems doesn't make you a good person. Understanding virtue doesn't make you virtuous. The life and the work can be radically disconnected. We can learn from his ideas while acknowledging his personal catastrophe. They don't cancel each other out. Modern scholars still argue about what he really meant. Was he a collectivist who subordinated individuals to the state, or a champion of liberty? A primitivist who wanted to return to the forest, or a sophisticated theorist of republican government? A rationalist building systems, or a romantic celebrating feeling? The answer is he was all of these, inconsistently, at different times, in different texts. Trying to make him coherent requires ignoring half of what he wrote. Better to accept the contradictions and ask what they reveal. His influence on feminism is complicated and troubling. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, partly as a response to Rousseau, challenging his argument in Emile that women's education should focus on pleasing men and managing households. He believed women and men had fundamentally different natures, requiring different educations. Women were naturally modest, nurturing, emotional. Educating them like men would destroy their feminine virtue. This was reactionary even by 18th century standards. Yet his emphasis on natural equality and his critique of artificial social hierarchies provided tools later feminists used to dismantle gender oppression, even if that meant working against his explicit views on women. His writing on music, often ignored, was significant in his time. He argued that melody should dominate harmony, that music's power came from its connection to emotion and language, that French opera had become too intellectual and needed Italian music's directness and passion. He composed an opera, Le Devin du Village, that was performed for the king. His dictionary of music was a standard reference for decades. This wasn't a side interest. For Rousseau, music exemplified the natural communication between souls that language had corrupted. In melody, especially simple folk melody, he heard traces of humanity's original voice, undistorted by civilization's artifice. Everything he touched became contested ground. Education, politics, nature, selfhood, emotion, civilization. He didn't settle debates, he started them, framed them in ways that made neutrality impossible. You had to have a position on Rousseau, agree or disagree, but you couldn't ignore him. 250 years after his death, we're still arguing, still trying to figure out if civilization is progress or trap, if inequality is natural or constructed, if education should liberate or socialize, if authentic selfhood requires rejecting society or engaging it. These are his questions. He gave them to us, along with provisional answers that created more problems than they solved. Maybe that's the mark of profound philosophy, not answers that close discussion, but questions that keep it alive. The revolution he helped inspire destroyed everything he believed in within a decade of his death. 1789. The Bastille falls, crowds in Paris chant his name, revolutionary leaders quote the social contract like scripture. They're building the republic of virtue he imagined, where citizens sacrifice private interest for the general will. Robespierre, the incorruptible one, keeps a bust of Rousseau in his room. He visits Rousseau's grave like a pilgrim to a shrine. The revolution claims him as its prophet. Then comes the terror, 40,000 executions, the guillotine running daily, enemies of virtue eliminated in the name of the people's will, dissenters accused of placing private judgment above the general will, the exact crime Rousseau warned against. The Republic of Virtue becomes a Republic of Blood. Was this Rousseau's vision realized or perverted? The question tears apart his legacy. His defenders argue the terror betrayed his principles. He advocated persuasion, not violence. His legislator was supposed to inspire through wisdom, not coerce through fear. The forced unity of revolutionary France, where disagreement meant death, violated everything he meant by the legitimate political authority. The Jacobins took his language and twisted it into justification for dictatorship. His critics see a straight line from his text to the scaffold. The social contract says citizens who refuse to obey the general must be forced to be free. Forced to be free. The phrase is right there. It sounds like double-speak, like justification for totalitarian control. If the general will is always right, and if the state embodies the general will, then opposing the state means you're objectively wrong, morally corrupt, an enemy who must be eliminated. The terror didn't betray Rousseau, it fulfilled him. Both readings are possible. That's the problem. His texts contain the seeds of both liberation and oppression. The ambiguity isn't an accident or a failure of clarity, it's built into the structure of his thought. Collective freedom versus individual rights, unity versus diversity, virtue enforced versus virtue chosen. He wanted both sides of these contradictions simultaneously, and history keeps showing they're incompatible. The Romantics loved him for completely different reasons. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Byron. They didn't care about the social contract. They cared about the confessions, about Emile's nature worship, about the critique of artificial society. Rousseau became the prophet of authenticity, of feeling over reason, of individual genius against conformist mediocrity. Wordsworth walked through revolutionary France in the early 1790s, thrilled by what he saw. Bliss was it, in that dawn to be alive. He was channeling Rousseau's vision of regenerated humanity. Later, Disillusioned by the terror, he retreated to nature, to the Lake District, writing poetry about childhood innocence and natural education. Still Rousseau, different emphasis. Mary Shelley, daughter of Wollstonecraft, and Godwin wrote Frankenstein partly as commentary on Rousseau. The creature is born innocent, naturally good. Society's rejection makes him a monster. He reads books, educates himself, develops moral sense, but isolation and persecution corrupt him. Is the creature responsible for his crimes, or is society? The novel doesn't answer cleanly. That's the Rousseauan dilemma embedded in Gothic horror. Thoreau at Walden Pond is performing Rousseau. The cabin in the woods, the rejection of society's demands, the experiment in simple living. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately. That's Rousseau's language, Rousseau's project. Thoreau even acknowledges it, though he pushes back against Rousseau's pessimism, arguing you can maintain integrity while engaging society selectively. But the dream of authentic selfhood discovered through withdrawal, that's pure Rousseau. The American transcendentalists absorbed him through multiple filters. Emerson's self-reliance echoes the discourse on inequality. Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Conformity is death. True life requires listening to the inner voice, trusting natural intuition over inherited convention. These aren't Emerson's original ideas. He's translating Rousseau for New England. 19th century nationalism claimed him too. The idea that people share collective identities, that nations are organic communities with distinct characters, that political legitimacy requires cultural unity. These concepts, now assumed as obvious, were radical in Rousseau's time. He helped invent the modern notion that political boundaries should match cultural boundaries, that Germans should have a German state, Italians an Italian state, because shared language and customs create a general will. This had liberating effects initially. Subject peoples fighting imperial domination found in Rousseau justification for self-determination. But it also fueled ethnic nationalism, the idea that only culturally homogeneous societies can be legitimate. Minorities become problems. Diversity becomes weakness. The general will requires uniformity. 20th century nationalism's darkest manifestations have Rousseauian DNA, however much he'd have been horrified. Freud absorbed Rousseau indirectly but profoundly. The idea that civilization requires repression, that social life demands sacrificing natural desires, that culture is built on sublimated instinct. Civilization and its discontents is essentially a psychoanalytic rewrite of the discourse on inequality. We pay for civilization's benefits with neurosis, with guilty unhappiness, with the repression of drives that can never be fully eliminated. Freud was more pessimistic. He saw no way back and doubted civilization's benefits outweighed its costs. But the basic framework is Rousseau's. Existentialists, especially Sartre, circled back to authenticity and bad faith. Living authentically means acknowledging freedom, taking responsibility, refusing society's prefabricated roles. Bad faith means pretending you're not free, hiding behind social expectations, blaming circumstances for choices. This is Rousseau's authentic self versus social self, reframed through phenomenology. Sartre didn't acknowledge the debt, but it's unmistakable. Even behaviorism, which rejected everything Rousseau stood for, defined itself against him. Watson and Skinner argued there's no innate human nature. We're products of conditioning, blank slates shaped entirely by environment. This was deliberate repudiation. Rousseau's natural man was the enemy. Proving human nature was constructed, not given, became the behaviorist mission. The fact that they needed to refute him proves his continued dominance. Education theory remains his most visible legacy. Progressive education, child-centered learning, discovery methods, respecting developmental stages. Montessori, Dewey, Piaget all drew on Emile directly. The idea that children aren't miniature adults requiring discipline and rote learning, but developing beings with their own logic at each stage. That education should follow natural development rather than impose arbitrary content. That intrinsic curiosity matters more than external rewards. This sounds obvious now. It wasn't in 1760. Education meant memorization, strict discipline, breaking the child's will, imposing adult knowledge through authority. Rousseau argued this destroys natural capacity for learning. Let children explore, question, discover. Provide guidance, not commands. Shape the environment, don't lecture. These principles revolutionized educational philosophy, even though practice lagged centuries behind. Critics charge this romanticizes childhood and produces entitled adults unprepared for reality. Maybe. But try finding a modern educator who explicitly rejects child-centered learning. Even traditionalists couch their arguments in terms of what's best for children's development. Rousseau won that debate so thoroughly, we've forgotten there was a debate. Political theory kept wrestling with his legacy. Rawls's theory of justice, the most influential political philosophy text of the late 20th century, is essentially a liberal revision of the social contract. Rawls tries to reconcile individual rights with legitimate collective authority to find principles of justice everyone could rationally accept. He replaces Rousseau's general will with the original position, a thought experiment where people choose principles behind a veil of ignorance. Different mechanism, the same project. How do we create legitimate political authority that respects both freedom and equality? Communitarians like Michael Sandel and Alasdair MacIntyre push back against liberal individualism by invoking something like Rousseau's vision. We're not isolated individuals with pre-political rights. We're embedded in communities that shape our identities and give meaning to our lives. Political philosophy that ignores these bonds, that treats us as abstract rational actors, misses what makes us human. This is Rousseau against Locke and Kant, still fighting. Environmental philosophy claims him as a founder, though he'd be puzzled by the designation. His nature wasn't wilderness to be preserved, but a moral and educational resource. Still, the idea that modern civilization alienates us from nature, that reconnecting with natural rhythms offers psychological and moral benefits, that unlimited development destroys something essential. These are Rousseauian themes, now foundational to environmentalism. Deep ecology takes it further. Humanity's separation from nature is the fundamental error. We're not above nature, but part of it. Civilizational progress is regress, destroying the web of life we depend on. This is Rousseau's primitivism, updated for the Anthropocene. Whether he'd endorse it is questionable, but they're using his tools. Social contract theory itself is fragmented. Consent-based versions argue legitimate authority requires actual agreement somehow. Hypothetical versions, like Rawls's, argue it's legitimate if people would agree under ideal conditions. Communitarian versions argue the contract isn't among individuals, but between generations, binding communities across time. All variations on Rousseau's original question, why should I obey? His influence on psychology and therapy is subtler, but real. The idea that authentic selfhood exists beneath social conditioning, that therapy means uncovering your true self, that mental health requires aligning outer life with inner truth. These assumptions, now baked into therapeutic culture, are Rousseauian. The authentic self might be a fiction, a culturally specific invention, but it's his fiction. Even his critics are shaped by him. When someone argues we should embrace civilization's demands, that authenticity is overrated. That social roles enable rather than constrain, they're arguing against Rousseau. He set the terms. You can reject his conclusions, but you're still on his battlefield. His writing style influenced literature as dramatically as his ideas influenced philosophy. The Confessions pioneered psychological realism, interior monologue, the unreliable narrator. Proust's multi-volume self-examination owes everything to Rousseau. Dostoevsky's tortured narrators, obsessively justifying themselves, confessing and concealing simultaneously. Rousseau's descendants. The romantic novel as genre descends from Julie. Emotional intensity, natural settings, lovers against society, tragic endings affirming spiritual values over material success. Goethe's Werther, which sparked copycat suicides across Europe, was directly inspired by Julie. The whole 19th century tradition of novels about sensitive souls crushed by conventional society traces back to Rousseau. His paranoia, documented exhaustively in later writing, raises uncomfortable questions. Was he mentally ill? He clearly suffered delusions, believed in vast conspiracies against him, saw enemies everywhere. Modern diagnosis suggests paranoid personality disorder, possibly schizophrenia. Does this invalidate his philosophy? Should we read his political theory differently, knowing its author was psychologically unstable? Some argue his personal breakdown and philosophical radicalism are connected. Rejecting society wasn't just intellectual position, but psychological necessity. The same traits that made him brilliant, the refusal to conform, the obsessive self-examination, the inability to accept social norms. These also drove him mad. Genius and madness, not separate but intertwined. Others insist the work stands independent of the author's mental state. Truth doesn't depend on the psychological condition of whoever discovered it. Mathematical theorems don't become false if the mathematician goes insane. Rousseau's arguments must be evaluated on their merits, not his mental health. Both positions miss something. The work and the life illuminate each other without one determining the other. His philosophy of authenticity gains poignancy from his inability to achieve it. His critique of society resonates because it comes from someone who genuinely couldn't function within social norms. The paranoia and the brilliance emerge from the same source, the same refusal of easy answers, the same inability to accept things as they are. 2.5 centuries later, we're still arguing, still trying to figure out which Rousseau is real. The democrat or the totalitarian, the lover of freedom or the enforcer of virtue, the prophet of authenticity or the architect of conformity. Maybe asking which is real misses the point. Maybe both Rousseaus exist because the contradictions he identified are real. Freedom and order, individual and community, nature and civilization. These aren't puzzles with solutions. They're tensions we navigate constantly, never resolving, always balancing. He showed us the tensions, we're still living them. His educational legacy deserves separate attention because it transformed how we think about children and learning. Before Emile, childhood was preparation for adulthood, nothing more. Children were miniature adults, incomplete, deficient, needing correction and discipline to become proper members of society. Their thoughts didn't matter, their feelings were irrelevant. Education meant imposing knowledge, breaking the child's will, instilling obedience. Rousseau inverted everything. Childhood isn't deficiency, but a distinct phase with its own value, its own way of experiencing the world. Children aren't broken adults, they're complete children. Education shouldn't impose adult knowledge prematurely, but allow natural development, following the child's curiosity and readiness. The child has innate goodness that unfolds if not corrupted by bad teaching. This sounds obvious now. It wasn't obvious in 1762. Suggesting children should play, should explore, should learn through experience rather than rote memorization was revolutionary. Letting development proceed at the child's pace rather than forcing adult timelines was radical. Progressive education movements from Pestalozzi to Montessori to modern constructivist approaches all trace back to Emile. The idea that education means drawing out rather than pouring in, that learning happens through activity and discovery, that curriculum should match developmental stages, that teachers guide rather than dictate. All Rousseau. Even his specific recommendations, controversial and sometimes absurd, sparked productive debates. Should we delay reading instruction? He thought literacy before age 12 damages natural development. Modern educators disagree, but the question of when and how to teach reading, whether earlier is always better, that's his question. Should education be individualized? Emile has one tutor devoted entirely to him, tailoring everything to his specific needs and interests. Impossible to scale, but the principle that education should adapt to the child rather than forcing every child into identical molds, this drives contemporary discussions of differentiated instruction and personalized learning. His views on female education, presented through Sophie's story in Emile's final section, are appalling by modern standards. Sophie is educated to be pleasing to men, to manage households, to raise children. Her education is narrower, less intellectual, designed to make her a good wife. Rousseau explicitly states women's education should differ from men's because their social roles differ. Feminists rightly condemned this. Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published just 30 years after Emile, was partially a furious response to Rousseau's sexism. If education develops innate human capacities, and women are human, why should their education be limited? The contradiction is obvious, yet even here his influence is complicated. The same book that restricted women's intellectual development also suggested female nature had value, that qualities coded feminine, emotion, intuition, care, weren't simply inferior to male rationality. Some feminist readings argue Rousseau inadvertently provided tools for challenging patriarchy by valorizing the feminine, even while trying to confine it to domestic sphere. His religious views, expressed most fully in the profession of faith of a Savoyard vicar, an extended section within Emile, managed to offend everyone. Too religious for atheist philosophers, too heretical for Orthodox Christians. The Archbishop of Paris condemned it. The book was burned in multiple cities. What was so offensive? Rousseau rejected revealed religion, miracles, ecclesiastical authority. He argued for natural religion, what we can know about God through reason and conscience alone. Everyone has inner moral sense, divine spark, without needing priests or scripture. Organized religion corrupts this natural faith with dogma, ritual, intolerance. This is deism, fashionable among Enlightenment intellectuals. But Rousseau went further, insisting reason alone isn't enough. We know God through feeling, through the heart's testimony, through immediate intuition. Conscience, not logic, reveals moral truth. The combination alienated both sides. Rationalists thought he abandoned reason for mysticism. Believers thought he abandoned faith for philosophy. He occupied uncomfortable middle ground. Too religious for secularists, too secular for the devout. Yet this position, natural religion grounded in feeling and conscience, deeply influenced Romantic religiosity and liberal theology. The idea that authentic faith is personal, inward, emotional, rather than doctrinal, that established churches obstruct rather than facilitate genuine spirituality. These became dominant themes in 19th century religious thought. Transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau are unthinkable without Rousseau. Their celebration of nature as revelation, their distrust of institutions, their insistence on individual conscience over social conformity, their belief in innate goodness requiring only removal of artificial constraints. Pure Rousseau translated into American idiom. His impact on art and aesthetics reshaped creative culture. Before Rousseau, art meant following rules, mastering established forms, pleasing sophisticated audiences. Neoclassical aesthetics valued order, proportion, restraint, imitation of ancient models. Romantic aesthetics, which Rousseau pioneered, valued spontaneity, emotion, originality, authenticity. Art should express the artist's inner truth, not conform to external standards. Rules constrain genius. True creativity breaks conventions. The artist as rebel, misunderstood by conventional society, but vindicated by history. This mythology begins with Rousseau, his confessional writing style, the intimate first-person voice sharing personal struggles and emotions became standard for Romantic literature. Byron's poetry, Wordsworth's autobiographical verse, Goethe's Werther, the entire tradition of the artist bearing his soul, confessing in print. Rousseau wrote the template, the cult of the artist as special being, too sensitive for ordinary life, suffering for their art, living outside bourgeois morality. This image, which still dominates popular culture's view of artists, is Rousseauian. He lived it before theorizing it. His inability to hold jobs, his conflicts with patrons, his wandering from place to place, these became evidence of genius rather than failure. Society's rejection proved his superiority. Whether this mythology helps or harms artists is debatable. It romanticizes suffering, excuses bad behavior, creates impossible standards. But it also validates pursuing art despite social pressure, legitimizes unconventional lives, insists creativity matters more than commercial success. Environmental philosophy claims Rousseau as founder. His celebration of nature, his conviction that civilization alienates us from our true home, his vision of simpler life in harmony with natural world, these themes echo through ecological movements. Deep ecology, which argues nature has intrinsic value apart from human use, draws on Rousseau's anti-anthropocentrism. Wilderness preservation movements invoke his praise of untouched nature. Critiques of consumerism and technological society repeat his arguments about artificial needs corrupting natural simplicity. Yet environmentalists also recognize problems with his nature worship. Indigenous peoples aren't noble savages living in harmony with nature. They're complex societies with their own histories, technologies, environmental impacts. Romanticizing them as naturally ecological ignores their agency and diversity. Nature itself isn't benign. It includes disease, predation, natural disasters, scarcity. Rousseau's idealized nature never existed. His state of nature is thought experiment, not anthropological description, but readers treated it as historical reality, creating lasting misconceptions. Still, his core insight remains valuable. We're part of nature, not separate from it. Alienation from natural world damages us psychologically and physically. Technological society's costs include environmental destruction and spiritual impoverishment. However problematic his specific formulations, the questions he raised about humanity's relationship with nature remain urgent. His influence on music is less obvious but real. He composed operas, wrote music theory, argued in famous Querelle de Buffon that Italian opera's melodic expressiveness surpassed French opera's harmonic complexity. Music should touch the heart directly, not display compositional technique. This preference for melody over harmony, emotion over intellect, simplicity over elaboration, aligned with his broader aesthetic and philosophical commitments. Music, like everything else, should be natural, authentic, emotionally direct. Romantic composers absorbed these ideas. Beethoven's heroic individualism, Schubert's intimate expressiveness, the whole 19th century emphasis on music as emotional communication rather than formal structure, these reflect Rousseau's aesthetic priorities. His impact on nationalism was profound and disturbing. His emphasis on cultural particularity, on distinct peoples with unique characters shaped by history and environment, provided intellectual foundation for nationalist movements. The general will applies to particular communities, not universal humanity. Each nation has its own spirit, its own path. This could support benign cultural patriotism, celebrating diversity, allowing people's self-determination. But it also fueled aggressive nationalism, ethnic exclusion, romantic myths of racial destiny. 19th century nationalists cited Rousseau constantly, usually ignoring his cosmopolitan passages, his insistence that patriotism shouldn't mean hating other nations. The tension is inherent in his thought. He valued both universal humanity and particular communities. How do you love your own people without despising others? How do you maintain cultural identity without xenophobia? He never resolved this. Neither have we. Fascist appropriations of Rousseau are particularly troubling. Italian and German fascists cited him, emphasizing collective identity over individual rights, general will as basis for totalitarian unity, natural inequality justifying hierarchy. These readings cherry-pick and distort, but the fact they're possible reveals ambiguities in his work. Defenders argue fascism betrays everything Rousseau stood for. He championed equality, popular sovereignty, individual freedom. Fascism destroys all three. The appropriation is cynical misreading, not legitimate interpretation. Yet the ambiguities exist. His language of organic community, his suspicion of pluralism, his willingness to force people to be free, these can be twisted toward authoritarian ends, not because he intended this, but because political philosophy is dangerous. Ideas have consequences beyond their author's intentions. His personal failures haunt his legacy. Abandoning 5 children to Foundling Hospital while writing Emile, a treatise on proper child rearing, is monstrous hypocrisy. He knew it. His attempts to justify this in Confessions are pathetic. He was poor. He couldn't provide. To raise his family would have interfered. The children were better off without him. None of this convinces. Should this invalidate his philosophy? Some say yes. A man who abandons his children while preaching about education and virtue forfeits credibility. His theories are self-serving rationalization, not genuine insight. Others separate work from life. Rousseau's failures as father and person don't determine whether his arguments are sound. Judge the philosophy on its merits, not the philosopher's character. A third position suggests the failure illuminates the work. His writing about childhood is so powerful because he knew intimately the guilt of failing children. His emphasis on natural goodness corrupted by society applies to himself. He was defending his own nature against accusations of monstrosity. The philosophy is autobiography, confession dressed as theory. All 3 positions miss something. The hypocrisy is real. The philosophy stands independent of it. The life and work illuminate each other. All 3 statements are true simultaneously. His final years were sad. Paranoid, isolated, convinced everyone conspired against him, he wandered from refuge to refuge. He wrote obsessively, defending himself against imagined accusations, explaining his innocence to posterity. The late autobiographical works, Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques and Reveries of a Solitary Walker, are brilliant and heartbreaking. A great mind trapped in delusion, still capable of profound insight between episodes of paranoia. He died in 1778, aged 66, living in a cottage provided by a sympathetic aristocrat. The circumstances were mundane. He went for a morning walk, felt ill, returned home, collapsed, probably a stroke. Some conspiracy theorists claimed he was murdered. He wasn't. He was just an old man in poor health who died, yet his death became mythology. Romantic writers portrayed him as martyr, destroyed by society's persecution. Revolutionary France claimed him as prophet, reburying his remains in the Pantheon with elaborate ceremony. The man who couldn't function in any social setting became national hero. The irony would have amused and pained him. Everything he feared happened. His work was misunderstood, appropriated, twisted. His life became public spectacle. His privacy was violated. His reputation was weaponized in political battles he never chose. But something else happened too. Millions read his words and felt understood, felt their own alienation validated, felt permission to question what everyone else accepted, felt the possibility of living differently. That legacy, invisible and immeasurable, matters more than statues or state funerals. He changed how people think about themselves. That's enough. Walk into any philosophy classroom today, mention the social contract, and you're speaking Rousseau's language, whether you know it or not. The vocabulary he invented, the questions he framed, the problems he identified, these form the background of modern political discourse. We argue about individual rights versus collective good, about authenticity versus conformity, about natural human nature versus social conditioning. These are his arguments, still unresolved. Liberal democracies claim him. Every constitution, asserting popular sovereignty, echoes his doctrine that legitimate authority flows from the people's will. American revolutionaries read him. French revolutionaries worshipped him. Democratic movements worldwide invoke his principles. Government exists by consent. Laws must reflect the general will. Citizens are sovereign. These ideas seem obvious now. They weren't before Rousseau, but authoritarian movements also claim him. The general will can justify forcing dissent into silence. If the people have spoken, opposition becomes treason against collective wisdom. Totalitarian regimes from Jacobins to modern dictatorships have wrapped themselves in Rousseau's language, while crushing individual freedom. He provided vocabulary for tyranny masquerading as democracy. Which interpretation is correct? Both and neither. His work contains genuine insight into democratic legitimacy and dangerous potential for abuse. You cannot have one without risking the other. Collective self-governance requires some subordination of individual preference to group decision. Where does legitimate authority end and tyranny begin? Rousseau asked the question brilliantly. He didn't answer it adequately. We're still trying. Education absorbed his revolution completely. Progressive education, child-centered learning, developmental appropriateness, all traced directly to Emile. The idea that childhood is a distinct stage requiring different approach rather than miniature adulthood, that's Rousseau. Learning through experience rather than rote memorization, that's Rousseau. Respecting the child's natural curiosity and developmental readiness, that's Rousseau. Montessori, Dewey, Piaget, every major educational reformer of the past 2 centuries built on his foundation. Modern parents reading books about gentle parenting and natural consequences are encountering his ideas filtered through generations, but essentially unchanged. The child has nature that must be respected, not broken. Education is drawing out, not pouring in. These principles feel obvious now, because Rousseau made them so. Yet his actual prescriptions in Emile are absurd. The total control over environment, the manipulation disguised as freedom, the bizarre paranoia about social corruption, the exclusion of Sophie from real education, while Emile gets everything. Apply his system literally, and you'd produce damaged children, not natural men. His insight about respecting childhood is profound. His specific advice is often terrible. We keep the insight, discard the method, claim his legacy. Romanticism wouldn't exist without him. The elevation of feeling over reason, the celebration of nature, the emphasis on individual authentic experience, the suspicion of civilization and progress, the fascination with the sublime and the wild, all emerge from Rousseau. Wordsworth walking the Lake District, Thoreau at Walden Pond, every person who's felt cities are artificial and nature is real. They're thinking with concepts he created. The Romantic movement shaped everything that followed. Modern environmentalism, back to nature movements, the valorization of wilderness, the feeling that something essential is lost in technological progress. These are Rousseauan themes. We're living inside his imagination whether we realize it or not. Or, psychology absorbed his model of self, the authentic inner self versus the false social self. This distinction structures modern therapy. The goal of becoming who you really are, of discovering your true self beneath layers of social conditioning, of living authentically. This is Rousseau's project. Existentialism, humanistic psychology, the entire self-help industry, all assume his framework. When someone says they need to find themselves, when someone talks about being true to themselves, when someone distinguishes between their real feelings and what they're supposed to feel, they're using Rousseauan categories. The language is so naturalized we forget it's a theory, not obvious truth. Other cultures don't assume an authentic inner self waiting to be discovered. That's a specifically modern Western idea, and Rousseau is its prophet. His analysis of inequality remains urgent. Walk through any major city, see the homeless beside luxury condominiums, watch the wealth gap expand year after year, and his second discourse reads like contemporary journalism. Private property created inequality. Inequality created government to protect itself. The rich convinced the poor that laws protecting wealth serve everyone. The system is rigged from the start. Marxists claimed him as predecessor. Anarchists claimed him as inspiration. Democratic socialists quote him. Conservative critics blame him for class warfare rhetoric. Everyone acknowledges he diagnosed something real. Societies are unequal. Inequality seems unjust. Justifications for inequality often serve the privileged. How do we reconcile individual freedom with collective equality? He asked it first. His solution, the social contract transforming natural freedom into civil freedom, sounds elegant until you try implementing it. What does the general will actually look like in practice? How do you distinguish it from majority tyranny or manipulated consensus? Rousseau knew this was hard. He admitted small, homogeneous, virtuous populations might manage it. Large, diverse, corrupt societies probably couldn't. He offered diagnosis without cure. Modern communitarians embrace his critique of liberal individualism. Societies aren't collections of isolated individuals pursuing self-interest. We're social creatures. Community matters. Shared values matter. Common good exists beyond individual preferences. Rousseau understood this against Enlightenment individualism, but liberals counter that community can be oppressive. Individuals need protection from collective pressure. Rights matter precisely because majorities can be wrong. Freedom means ability to dissent from community norms. Rousseau's organic community becomes suffocating conformity in practice. His answer to alienation is surrender to collective, which solves nothing. The debate continues because both sides are partly right. We are individuals and community members. We need freedom and belonging. We want authenticity and connection. Rousseau identified the tension. He didn't resolve it. Perhaps it's unresolvable. His influence on music is unexpected but real. The cult of genius, the artist as tortured soul expressing authentic emotion, the composer as prophet rather than craftsman. This romantic conception of musical creation comes partly from Rousseau. He was composer himself, minor but genuine. His opera Le Devin du Village was successful. His writings on music influenced aesthetic theory. The idea that music expresses emotion directly, that its language of feeling transcending words, that it connects us to something primal and true. These are Rousseauan ideas. Mozart read him. Beethoven knew his work. The Romantics worshipped him. The 19th century's transformation of music from entertainment to spiritual experience follows his aesthetic principles. Literature absorbed him completely. The confessional mode he invented in his Confessions created entire genre. Autobiography as self-examination, as attempt to understand oneself by narrating one's life, as justification and explanation and plea for understanding. This starts with Rousseau. Every memoir exploring childhood trauma, every autobiography seeking to explain how the author became who they are, every confessional essay about personal failure. These descend from his model. His influence on the novel is subtler but pervasive. The romantic novel, with its emphasis on feeling, its first-person narration, its focus on individual consciousness against social convention, its celebration of authentic emotion. This comes partly from Julie and partly from his general influence on culture. The Bildungsroman, the novel of education and development, owes debt to Emile's narrative structure. His political legacy is most contested and most important. Every democratic movement since 1760 cites popular sovereignty, general will, social contract, consent of the governed. These are his terms. American Declaration of Independence's assertion that governments derive just powers from consent of the governed. That's Rousseau's principle. French Revolution's appeal to general will and popular sovereignty. That's explicit Rousseau. But every totalitarian democracy, every plebiscitary dictatorship, every authoritarian regime claiming to represent the people's true will also uses his language. The general will can justify anything if leaders claim to embody it. Rousseau gave democratic movements their vocabulary. He also gave dictators their justification. Was he Democrat or totalitarian? The question is wrong. He was both and neither. He identified real problems with representative government, real insights about popular sovereignty, real tensions between individual and collective. His solutions were incomplete, sometimes contradictory, occasionally dangerous. We're still working through implications. His legacy is impossible to summarize because it's everywhere. Modern life is unthinkable without categories he created: self, society, nature, authenticity, alienation, legitimacy, sovereignty, education, childhood. All these concepts bear his mark. We think with his ideas even when we disagree with them. Critics charge him with contradictions. He praised natural man while living in cities. He celebrated family while abandoning his children. He demanded authenticity while crafting elaborate persona. He attacked civilization while seeking fame within it. He preached equality while accepting patronage from aristocrats. The contradictions are real, undeniable, damning. But perhaps the contradictions are the point. He lived the tensions he described. He experienced alienation he diagnosed. He felt the impossibility of being natural man in corrupt society. He embodied the problem without solving it. The life and work together form a testimony to modernity's dilemmas. His writing remains powerful because it's honest about difficulty. He doesn't offer easy answers. He doesn't pretend problems are simple. He acknowledges contradictions while trying to think through them. The social contract is difficult, sometimes obscure, full of tensions. That's because the subject is difficult. Any political theory that seems simple is lying. His psychology remains recognizable because he describes something real. We do feel divided between inner truth and outer performance. We do experience social expectations as constraints. We do long for authenticity while depending on others' recognition. We do feel civilization's benefits and costs. He named experiences we still have. His educational insights survive because children haven't changed. They do learn through experience. They do develop in stages. They do need respect for their nature. They do suffer from excessive control and premature forcing. Modern developmental psychology confirms many of his observations, even while rejecting his system. His political insights survive because democracy remains hard. Representing the people's will without tyranny, balancing individual rights with collective good, creating legitimate authority without oppression. These problems are permanent. Rousseau helps us think about them even when his solutions fail. The man was impossible, paranoid, difficult, ungrateful, selfish, hypocritical, cruel. He made everyone around him miserable. He betrayed friends, abandoned children, turned patronage into persecution narrative. He was not a good person by most measures, but he was a great thinker. He saw things others missed. He asked questions that needed asking. He challenged assumptions that needed challenging. He wrote with passion and honesty that still moves readers. The work transcends the man. His final gift was showing us ourselves. In his contradictions, we see our own. In his alienation, we recognize our own. In his search for authenticity, we find our own quest. In his failure to resolve the tensions he identified, we confront our own unresolved struggles. He changed how we think about being human. Before Rousseau, humans were rational souls, social animals, subjects of kings, members of orders and estates. After Rousseau, we're individuals seeking authenticity, alienated from society, longing for nature, divided between inner truth and outer performance, searching for legitimate community while protecting individual freedom. That transformation is his achievement. Whether it's progress or disaster remains debatable. Probably it's both, but it's irreversible. We can't go back to pre-Rousseau consciousness any more than we can return to the state of nature he imagined. 2.5 centuries after his death, we're still arguing about him, still defending him, attacking him, misunderstanding him, appropriating him, still trying to figure out whether he was prophet or disaster, genius or fraud, liberator or tyrant. The arguments will continue because the questions remain open. How should we live? What makes government legitimate? How do we educate children? What is authentic life? How do we balance individual and community? These aren't historical questions. They're ours. Rousseau didn't answer them. He taught us how to ask them. In the end, that might be enough. Philosophy isn't about providing comfortable answers. It's about asking uncomfortable questions that force us to examine what we've taken for granted. Every person who questions whether their life is truly theirs, whether society's demands are legitimate, whether there's a better way to live, whether authentic existence is possible, they're thinking Rousseau's thoughts. The questions have become ours. That's how ideas become immortal, not by being correct, but by being inescapable. The watchmaker's son who fled Geneva at 15 died in a cottage garden at 66. Between those points stretched a life that refused every convention, burned every bridge, and somehow managed to rewire how humanity thinks about itself. He never held steady employment, never owned property, never raised his children, never maintained friendships past the point where honesty became inconvenient. By the standards he was born into, the standards of bourgeois respectability and civic contribution, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a catastrophic failure. And yet here we are, still speaking his language, still trapped in his questions, still unable to think about freedom or childhood or legitimacy or authenticity without using categories he invented. That's the strange power of ideas. They don't require their creator to be admirable. They don't need perfect consistency or complete systems. They just need to name something real, something people recognize, even if they'd never articulated it themselves. Rousseau named the alienation of modern life, the feeling that something essential has been lost, that we're performing rather than living, that society's demands conflict with our nature, that civilization's benefits come at unbearable cost. He named it so precisely that we've been trying to escape or embrace or understand that alienation ever since. Every commune, every back to the land movement, every person who quit their corporate job to find themselves, every parent who chose gentle parenting over authoritarian discipline, every revolutionary who insisted government requires consent, every writer who confessed shameful secrets to claim authenticity, every teenager who felt misunderstood by a corrupt adult world, they're all living inside Rousseau's imagination. The contradictions never resolved. We still don't know how to be individuals and community members simultaneously. We still can't reconcile freedom with equality, rights with solidarity, authentic self-expression with social harmony. We still feel civilization's corruption and depend on its benefits. We still want natural simplicity while enjoying technological convenience. Rousseau didn't solve these problems. He showed us their problems, that the tensions we feel aren't personal failures, but structural features of modern existence. That recognition doesn't make life easier. It might make it harder, but at least we know we're not alone in the struggle. His personal failures don't cancel his insights. His insights don't excuse his failures. Both exist, both matter. The man who abandoned 5 children wrote the most influential book on education ever published. That's not irony or hypocrisy alone. It's the human condition, the gap between what we know and what we do, between ideals and execution, between vision and reality. Maybe that's why he still speaks to us. Not because he figured it out, but because he didn't. He lived the contradictions he diagnosed. He failed at the authenticity he preached. He sought the community he couldn't sustain. He wanted the simplicity he couldn't achieve. In his failure, we see our own. In his struggle, we recognize ourselves. The Pantheon in Paris holds his remains beside Voltaire's, those old enemies united in death as honored fathers of the nation. Revolutionary France claimed them both, though their visions were incompatible. Voltaire believed in reason, progress, civilization, refined through Enlightenment. Rousseau believed civilization was the problem, that something precious was lost in becoming civilized, that feeling and conscience mattered more than reason. They're still arguing through us. Every political debate, every cultural conflict about progress versus tradition, every discussion of education or nature or authenticity echoes their dispute. The Enlightenment produced both voices. We inherited both legacies. We're still trying to reconcile them. History's judgment on Rousseau keeps shifting. Revolutionary icon, then totalitarian precursor, then romantic hero, then dangerous naif, then ecological prophet, then problematic genius. Every generation finds something different in his work because the work is large enough and contradictory enough to support multiple readings. That's not weakness, that's depth. Shallow thinkers are consistent because they don't see the complications. Rousseau saw them, lived them, tried to think through them, and couldn't resolve them. His honesty about the difficulty is more valuable than false certainty. Walk through any city today, and you'll see Rousseau's legacy in the parks, those artificial pieces of nature preserved within urban spaces, because we believe contact with green growing things is psychologically necessary. In the progressive schools, teaching through experience rather than memorization. In the therapy offices where people seek their authentic selves. In the ballot boxes asserting popular sovereignty. In the confession memoirs dominating bestseller lists. In the environmental movements fighting technological civilization's excesses. He's invisible now because he's everywhere. His ideas are the water we swim in, the assumptions we don't question because they seem natural. Only by reading him do we realize how strange and recent these ideas are, how different human life was before someone articulated them. The questions he asked remain open. How should we live? What makes authority legitimate? Can we be free and together simultaneously? Is authenticity possible within society? How do we educate without corrupting? What do we owe each other? What is the good life? Philosophy departments still argue these questions. Political movements still mobilize around competing answers. Individuals still struggle to live them daily. Rousseau didn't close these debates, he opened them permanently. That might be his greatest achievement. Not providing answers, but teaching us we need to ask. Not solving problems, but showing us they're problems requiring thought, rather than tradition's automatic response. Not offering certainty, but demonstrating that certainty is dangerous. That the important questions resist simple solutions. That living well means navigating tensions rather than eliminating them. The watchmaker's son who murdered his mother by being born, who read Plutarch at 6 and fled Geneva at 15, who converted and reconverted, who loved and abandoned, who wrote and burned bridges, who saw conspiracies and suffered real persecution, who imagined perfect societies while failing at basic human relationships, who died obscure and became immortal, who wanted only to be understood, and remains endlessly debated. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, impossible man, inescapable thinker, still here, still arguing, still forcing us to examine what we'd rather leave unquestioned. The questions are his legacy. The struggle to answer them is ours.